And so for us, the question is, what do we do about it in schools? What do we do as a result of this? We put out a paper that basically culled all of the research. And we asked ourselves a couple of questions. How does adversity impact how children learn? And how is this domain of development missing in the priorities of a school and classroom? So that's the questions that we tried to set out for. We tried to do a couple of things. One, we needed to align it to the development of a child and a learner in an educational setting. So if something worked somewhere, but it wasn't shown to work in a school, then we didn't include it. It also had to be measurable and malleable, that these are things that you could actually measure and notice along the way, and that they had to be able to be changed. So we had a question earlier about high schoolers and whether that was too late. And so all of this has to be stuff that is actually malleable, that you can actually change. And then there also had to be a research base demonstrating the impact of these building blocks on academic achievement. Again, so this is not an either or a nice to have, that this is how you learn, how you'll get the results that you're looking for. So that's how we created it. And so the first row is really important because this is a developmental framework, right? So it goes from the bottom all the way up. And so we're going to take that little journey together as we go through this. So the absolute fundamental starting point, the fundamental row, is around healthy development. And that's attachment, stress management, and self-regulation. Those are the basics. If you don't have those things as a child, it'll be really difficult for you to do all the other sorts of things that we ask children to do in school and in life. So it's really important to think about building attachment as a primary thing. And as we go up, you'll start to be able to notice, ooh, I have a child that's not able to be successful in one of those higher blocks. I'm going to need to go down and start to ask myself, what am I not providing that's making it difficult for them to exhibit those things? So this is the primary fundamental row of healthy development. Attachment looks like a lot of different things, but it starts extremely early. This is one of my colleagues, Brooke, with her newborn baby. Wait for it. Wait for it. There. Right? And for many of us, it literally starts right after the moment of birth. But for many of our children, staff we work with, folks in our community, it never happens, right? And so if this is the most fundamental aspect of what a child, human being needs, and they're not getting it from somewhere else, we can't be surprised anymore with the behaviors or the presentations of what we were talking about earlier. And so question starts to be, how do you build a school around attachment? How do you make sure that children feel attached with each other, with an adult? And sometimes there's a lot of research that shows just one adult that you don't want to disappoint can be all that a child needs, right? So this is the fundamental row here. The next row up is around school readiness. So that's self-awareness, relationship skills, executive functions. And these two rows are what great early learning is. The issue, though, is that for some reason we decided that once a child hits 7 years old, they no longer needed any of this. And that every child walks into first grade, fourth grade, eighth grade, Thanksgiving dinner, with all of these intact. They don't, right? But we then assume that they do, and we as eighth grade teachers, like I was, no longer think that it's necessary for us to spend time on those things. But if we know all of the neuroscience that we were just talking about, how it presents itself, and we choose to not build these blocks, then we know what's going to happen. Our roller coaster begins. So those are the fundamental two rows. And now we start to get into some of the higher order things. I talked about mindset earlier, and growth mindset in particular. One of the things that's really important about those rows is that if you start to see folks that are exhibiting a fixed or entity mindset, They're really into showing you that they know right now, that they're performing, not open to feedback, feeling like any feedback defines them, then you might have to ask yourself, there's some of these things that they might not have. And that's true for children in your classrooms, but it's also true for adults that you're working with, right? So I know a couple of folks that I work with who really struggle with feedback, for example, and they feel like it defines them. No one in this room, I'm sure. Feel like it defines them, and they have to push back, be defensive, prove that they are okay, right? But that's a fixed mindset. But oftentimes when we have that, it's because we don't feel like we have attachment that we can always fall back on. If you're feeling like, I'm really not as good as I wanted to be. Or the self-awareness even, that you may have aspects of your practice or yourself that you need to grow. So that's why these are a developmental framework, that the bottom two rows lead to the top. And so if you're starting to struggle with any of those things, sense of belonging in particular, and that's on our website, we go into the definitions of each of these and all the research studies that backed each block up, so it's interactive. And sense of belonging and attachment, it's hard for people to tell the difference sometimes. But the reason that sense of belonging is a higher order mindset is that you actually need to have attachment with a one-on-one level first before you can begin to have belonging with a group, a larger entity. So if you're thinking about a school where a kid isn't showing up very often, don't feel like they're a part of it, don't feel like it's for them, ask yourself whether they have an attachment or whether that's something that's missing. And that might be your entry point with that child in your classroom. Then we started to get into the higher rows, and resilience is something that's extremely important. And folks often ask, why is resilience in the fourth row? All my kids have resilience. I say, absolutely, that's absolutely right. And I used to talk about my kids' resilience all the time. The issue, though, is that for many of them, they're able to show resilience in context-dependent situations. So I had kids who were extremely resilient before 7 a.m., right? Making breakfast, getting their younger siblings together, parenting their parents, getting to school. Their day is spent by the time they show up to school, right? But also, the question is, what type of context are we setting in our schools and classrooms that's making resilience something that they think is important, something that they might want to exhibit? Because for many of my kids, when we first started, they appeared like they had no resilience. They gave up on tasks easily. They got frustrated very easily. The littlest things set them off, right? But it's because I hadn't created a context in our school and classroom that actually allowed for them to say, hey, this is a place where I'm going to persevere. This is a place where I'm going to give extra effort. It's going to be worth it, right? So yes, all of our students have resilience, but we need to be tuned into the context that we're setting up and whether that's a place that they actually feel like they want to give the effort to be resilient for. And if you're struggling to figure out what that is for a child, ask them about some of their experiences and where they feel like they give a lot of effort or they really care. And you'll start to learn the context for those situations and how that helped them. The last section here is something that's starting to really take off in education reform conversations. You'll notice that we didn't include grit on here. Again, we wanted to pick things that were malleable and not traits. And so now we're starting to think about agency and self-direction and curiosity and ultimately your civic identity, right? And so we start there. We want to say, I wish you had more self-direction. But do we ask ourselves, do you have attachment with someone? Do you have self-awareness, relationship skills, growth mindset, sense of belonging, sense of relevance that the time that we're spending here is actually meaningful to me, a growth mindset, resilience, all of those other things first. So this is why this is a developmental framework. And so when you're struggling with students or when you're trying to think of a frame to use with your schools, with your staff, this is a powerful framework. Because if you're ever demanding or wanting your children, especially if you think about what 12th grade, leaving 12th grade, what you want them to be able to exhibit, to be able to confront the world, have the life they choose, you got to be able to build it from the bottom up. So oftentimes we're really defining what that higher level is, that standard of what we think great stuff comes from, but we forget, especially after early learning, to actually purposefully build it in our schools and classrooms. This is a framework that can be very powerful. And again, there's a lot more information on our website about it.